Hello, this is Alex Birkett, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this episode, I talked to Evelyn Frison. This was a fun one because we did it in person, in real life, at a studio in Brooklyn. Usually, we record these conversations virtually via Riverside, which is great and convenient. But in recording virtually, you do lose some fidelity, both in terms of sound quality, but also the lack of body language and other dynamics that you just can't replace that are so fun about real-life conversations. So in this talk, we went deep on branding, brand marketing, and brand strategy. So how to uncover your differentiated selling propositions, how to do research, how to identify target audience, how branding and positioning inform messaging and marketing, and how brand and performance marketing campaigns should be integrated. We also talked about building communities. So Evelyn runs a fitness group community that I'm a part of, and we take some lessons from that and apply them to marketing and management and life. So this was a fun conversation. Without further ado, here is my talk with Evelyn Frison. I don't know anything about my audience. That's basically what I'm interested in and what you want to talk about. And then by proxy.
What are you interested in then?
I think if you have like unique case studies or experiences that you can actually talk about from the agency, that would be cool. But if there's any like privacy concerns, you don't have to. You can just speak in generalities or like hypotheticals.
Case study. So Boas, by the way, is I literally just launched it last week with two partners. And we have worked together on a variety of projects. So we do have case studies, but some of those things were completed not under the official umbrella of Boas. So I don't know if that makes a difference really, but it's like weird because like there's three main core members and then we have like a larger team. But our core members, we've brought each other in on projects, but never all together. But that's why we started the agency, because we were like, this is silly. We're sort of like going in circles when we should all just be invested in every project together and committed as a team and to like provide consistency. So that's like why we started it, because we were like, we all work together anyway. So like this just makes sense. It's a natural next step for all of us as independent consultants to form an agency. Yeah.
What is the agency? What do you do with the agency?
So I'm historically a brand strategist, or I would say an integrated marketer. And what I mean by that is I've worked across many different marketing channels and I understand how it's all connected. But there's a heavy focus on brand strategy at the agency, and I'm coming in as a partner strategist. I'm also sort of slipping into like a operational role, and something that's very exciting to me, and I think maybe just sort of a shift in my career, is that I feel most motivated when I am getting other people to do their best work. So it's kind of weird. I was thinking about it this week, but I look at myself a little bit more like a talent manager. And I kind of see my role, my emerging role, as like protecting the other team members' time so that they can focus on the things that they really like to do and do best and like move projects forward. So it's shifting. I'm a brand strategist, but also, again, transitioning into sort of an operational role.
Nice. Well, I'm a growth marketer, just archetypically. So I don't know anything about brand. How do you, like, what do you even define as like a brand campaign? Like, what is branding?
I would define branding as your unique positioning against your competitors and in the world. So it's your unique value proposition and then how you communicate that.
So it's sort of looking at the landscape of competitors, your ideal customers, I'm guessing, like in positioning yourself in relation to the existing market, the existing options. And what is like, what does positioning mean? Is like there's positioning, there's the messaging that like you use in your marketing campaigns and your website. There's like the sales scripts. Like I feel like positioning is one layer back from everything that the customer sees, right?
Yes. So the positioning drives all those other activities like the messaging strategy, like your go-to-market, like your performance. And it basically helps you define a story about who you are, why people should care, how you're differentiated from competitors, and what makes you unique. Storytelling is a very catchy word right now, and many people position themselves as storytellers in the marketing space. And there's an element of truth to that, but I think it's missing the strategic part of that process. And so positioning is extremely strategic. And it's about, again, positioning yourself away from competitors and why people should care.
Do you mostly work with consumer companies, or do you work with B2B brands as well?
I am industry agnostic, I like to say, because I think about this a lot too. You're solving a very specific problem, and so my process can apply to different industries. I've done a lot of work in the consumer space, and I think that happened naturally because I started my own consumer brand. Mm-hmm. So that's how I started consulting, is because I transitioned off my own business, and then people sort of naturally came to me because I had personal experience as well as the marketing experience. But I've done some tech, which was super fun, and I'd like to do more of, and B2B and personal branding too.
It seems like consumer brands are better at branding and positioning than B2B brands overall. I don't know. I feel like I work with B2B software companies with Omniscient. Even Omniscient, we're in a space that's quite crowded, right? SEO and content agencies. Mm-hmm. But I feel like a lot of B2B brands lean on their maybe technological advantages, their features. It's like a sea of sameness problem. You go on like some website for like a cloud security software and you're like, oh, we transform the cloud, or you know, it's everybody's got the same kind of synergistic transformation digital, like it's very like similar. Whereas I feel like consumer brands, maybe it's just like the very salient ones that I think about, like Nike or Magic Spoon, right? Like they've got very clear like colors and language they use, and like they really fit. I don't know. I feel like it's like they really index on uniqueness. Is that just my perception being in B2B, or?
No, that's very accurate. I think about this a lot. So the first thing I want to start with is that you're right. I do think that in B2B, there is a sea of sameness. Anytime I've done positioning work for B2B, one of the first things you do is look at competitors. So I look at it from a messaging angle, from a design angle, from a content angle, and it's all blue. Right? Like every logo is blue.
SAP blue.
Exactly. There might be like some different shades, but it's basically all blue. There's several reasons for that. I mean, in some cases, you know, blue is a very trustworthy color. A lot of banks use blue, and you might not want to use hot pink. But there is a sea of sameness. I do think that B2B companies could benefit a lot from looking at their brands and their positioning from a consumer angle, because at the end of the day, you still need to stand out. Mm-hmm. Now, the degree to which you need to do that might be a little bit different, but consumer brands are really good at that because you stand out or you die. If you think about going to Target and looking at face wash, you're probably confronted with 200 options. So you really need to make your mark and stand out from the rest of your competitors.
I always wonder in B2B, like what the spectrum is, where it's like on one end, it's complete sameness and like there's no differentiation. And then on the other extreme, like you're so different that you don't kind of fit the mental category that somebody has. So like, I think a CRM kind of has to look like a CRM, at least to get procured at like a large company, right? You've got a bunch of stakeholders and you're like, hey, like we're comparing among these 5 tools, HubSpot, Salesforce, et cetera. And then you've got one with just like outlandish language and like they don't seem to fit in the category. So I feel like there's got to be some level of conformity to at least like adhere to what people already think of when they think of like CRM or shampoo, right? Like it couldn't be like completely out of left field. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that, you know, people use blue for a reason, and it's because it conforms to industry standards and provides an anchor for how to look at the brand. I see more and more B2B companies experimenting. They might throw in like a pop of color. But there's a real need for that too. Again, I think the scale at which you can be unique shifts from industry to industry or from brand to brand. And you don't want to be unique for unique's sake. There's
sort of a risk tolerance associated with the end user too. Like I feel like MailChimp, they're kind of like a prosumer company too. I mean, they like you can be like I have a new personal newsletter with like a couple thousand subscribers, and I pay for like the basic version of MailChimp, but also I'm sure they have some Fortune 500 clients too. So they've got a little bit of a spectrum there, but they can be fun, right? Like they've got that little chimp guy that gives you a high five when you press send, and they've got really fun marketing copy. Whereas there's other types of products that maybe you're selling into like IT or developers, where like cutesy like consumer branding would put like a bad taste, like they wouldn't trust it as much or something. So it's like understanding your audience as well.
I was just about to say that. So again, I think everything comes back to your target audience, which is part of the positioning process. But you have to really understand who they are, what they want, what their problems are, what you're solving for. And a lot of that requires at least some research. Or if you're a startup, trial and error or a combination of the two. But that's super, super important. So some companies will have a higher tolerance for unique branding, or I should say some people, some companies, some people will have a higher tolerance for unique branding. Others won't. So you just have to really understand what they're looking for. Nice.
I'm going to try to get a little free consulting from you if that's cool.
Let's do it.
Okay. So I think we've done some basic positioning from our understanding. I don't think there's been any like scientific method towards it. How do you all right, we're Omniscient, we're a content SEO agency. How do we even start the positioning process? You mentioned target audience and understanding there. Like what kind of research will we need to do to get an understanding of like what our target audience wants, what our ideal customer profile wants, who they are? Like, do we start with interviewing our existing clients? Do we look at competitors? Like, what's like the first step off the starting block?
The first step off the starting block would be, number one, you should get all internal stakeholders in a meeting to discuss what their views and their hypotheses are of the target audience and see where there's overlap. Then the process from there is to validate or invalidate those points. So there needs to be some internal alignment about what you're trying to find out. And then the next step, I think, because you're an established company already, is you could do an audience survey. And I love audience surveys. And I often get companies that come to me and they're scared to do it because they don't want to bother their target audience. I have never, ever been on a project where there hasn't been some useful feedback from some type of survey, because people ultimately like to give their opinions. So I love doing surveys. I think that they can be very well designed. You have to have very clear goals going into it. You have to understand exactly what you're looking for, again, to validate or invalidate certain ideas, but they're extremely effective. On top of that, you can do individual customer interviews or focus groups. So a combination of those three things, individual interviews, focus groups, and surveys, will give you a lot of information.
Right. And so the audience survey is not your existing clients or your existing customers. That would be like a representative sample of somebody you believe is your target customer. So for us, it would be like a VP of marketing from a Fortune 1000 B2B company or something like that. And we would try to get in front of them, send them basically a survey, but it wouldn't be people that we already work with or already know about us.
It depends. So it depends, again, on your goals of doing the audience survey. So, for example, if you wanted to expand your products and services, then you might want to go to your existing customer base, right? Because it's easier to get sales from your existing customer base than new audiences. If you're doing a brand pivot, if you're maybe in the case of adding products and services, you can go outside of your current customers and try to identify your potential customers. And there's a variety of ways in which you can do that, but that's also effective, again, just depending on your goal.
Yeah, I could see the triangulation between those three, right? Like your own opinions and your stakeholders. So I'm imagining, like, just hypothetically, we could say, we believe that it's important to emphasize growth and attribution and kind of quantitative performance marketing. Or somebody else is like, actually, I think efficiency is the big thing now. Like artificial intelligence is the name of the game. We have to be efficient and cost effective and scalable. And then somebody else is like, no, quality. It's all about quality, right? And like human touch. And then we invoke those qualitative research exercises, the existing interviews, the focus groups, audience research with some combination of the two. And then we see how those sentiments land within those segments.
Yes. And before you start that process, what you want to do is identify very specific audience segments. Most businesses have several. So we just talked about your current audience versus your potential audience. I'm assuming that can be broken down even further.
Startups, large enterprises, prosumer, data tech, very technical tech companies. Yeah, we could definitely split that out into multiple categories.
They will all need different things, have different problems. And so you really want to be clear about identifying those segments. Sometimes research also helps you identify new segments. That's a huge benefit of the research. So that's another goal one can have in that process. But it's really important to break those down because that's ultimately what's going to give you the feedback to grow.
One idea I've had in the past is like, if you do have these multiple ICPs, is there, how do I put this? Is there like a case to be made for like aspirational branding? So let's say we work with startups, but we also work with SAP. If we choose to position ourselves for enterprise customers, then we'll probably have startups and scale-ups that also want to work with us because they eventually want to be enterprises, whereas vice versa doesn't really apply, right? If we're like, hey, we're for small businesses, then there's no way that the Fortune 500 would go for us. And like the consumer version of that is like you sort of have this aspirational, like Nike, right? Like Michael Jordan. It's like this, I'm not going to be Michael Jordan, but man, I want to be.
So I would challenge that a bit. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, although I haven't done a lot of research and I'm sort of in my own testing period with how this applies. I think corporations and much larger companies can learn a lot from startups. I've done both. I've worked for brands like Google and emerging brands. And when I say emerging brands, it's somebody's idea, right? They haven't even launched yet. And I think that there's probably more crossover than people realize, or that there should be more crossover than people realize. But in general, I do agree with you that it's hard to convince a corporate company to identify with startup issues. But then again, really, really large corporations, they have a ton of internal departments, even these like little tiny rogue experimental departments, and those might benefit from a startup mentality or some startup practices. One thing I think a lot about is how, going back to that crossover and that intersection, is how many, many, many brands and companies are not doing the fundamentals correctly of marketing. So going back to audience research. And so they can all benefit from the same processes, depending on what their problems are, depending on what their target audience is, and depending on their goals. But there's more crossover than I think they realize.
I do like that you, on the forum, emphasized I think you said back to basics, branding fundamentals. That's what we're all about in SEO as well. There's so many like topics now on LinkedIn where people are just like semantic SEO and topical maps and this and that. And it's like, you're like jumping the shark. Like you haven't done the basics. Like your website's broken, right? And I feel like that's probably the case with branding exercises too. There's some fundamental things that can get everybody in place.
100%. There's target. Often I see very large companies with messaging strategies, and I think, who is this for? Like you've done no target audience research. Or actually going back to B2B, this is a little off topic, but it just reminded me. I think about how their messaging is so jargony, because that's what you're sort of referring to, or at least one strain of the conversation.
The sea of sameness thing.
Yeah, but it's like your target audience is still human. Like, why are you talking to them like a robot? So there's a lot of opportunity there. I've sort of lost my train of thought, so I hope this gets cut
good.
out. But wait, what was your question?
Something about the fundamentals.
Oh, right. So if I continue on that, again, I've worked for really, really large corporations and tiny little emerging brands. And many times they are skipping ahead to doing things like, we need a TikTok. And I'm like, okay, but why? Like, why do you need a TikTok? Does your audience want you to be on TikTok? Like, who's your audience? And everyone across the board can benefit from a very disciplined approach to strategic foundations.
What's a common branding best practice that you believe is actually detrimental to most companies?
It's funny that I'm saying this because at the heart and soul of what I love to do, it is branding and the creative process that comes from the strategy. So managing that process, being a part of that process. I think a really big mistake, although maybe with the exception of B2B, but I have to marinate on that a bit, everyone fixates on the design. It is super important, especially in the consumer space. You cannot launch a brand unless that's pretty buttoned up. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm a big believer in the idiom that I'm about to mess up, which is good is good enough, or great is the enemy of good.
Yep, totally.
But I've seen a lot of startups really fixate on that and rebrand without doing the basics. So kind of coming back to that part of the conversation, I think that's a really big mistake that I've seen a lot of startups make. In terms of corporations, I think something that's a best practice that I don't necessarily believe in or think it's overdone. I'd have to give more thought to that. Most corporations are they might not be efficient in some of their processes, but they're pretty buttoned up and they have the resources to make mistakes. So
I have a couple, I actually apologize. Some of these questions are esoteric, but that's just the way my brain works. So if you're willing to enter the world of sort of hypothetical territory. So how much of branding is the role of a marketer? So like you're a marketer in-house or you're an agency and you're doing this foundational research that culminates in a messaging framework and like a design, style guides. How much of that is your brand versus like, there's sort of like a million touch points with a company, right? Like customer service touch points, sales touch points, and all of those sort of evoke emotions or sentiments for the consumer too, probably just as much as the colors of the website or the words you use in direct mail copy. And then how much of it, sorry, this is getting very esoteric, but how much of brand is the interplay between what the company does and what the consumer hears, so to speak? So the brand speaks and the consumer listens, but there's some interplay between those two. How much impact does the marketer actually have on the perception of the consumer in the end?
I'm biased, but I think brand is everything because when I say brand, I'm not talking about visual identity only or logo, which is something people default to, right? When they think of branding, I am talking about strategy at the most foundational basic level, which is knowing your audience and your differentiation from competitors. And that should drive everything along a larger marketing funnel or process. So I think it's everything. I also believe that marketing is the fuel that drives interaction at every consumer touch point. I think marketing should be involved in packaging. I think marketing should be involved in product. I believe marketing should be involved in messaging. And then, of course, the different channels of marketing, which is everything from events to SEO. And the reason I believe that is because strategy and brand strategy is the start of that marketing process. And as part of the brand strategy, knowing your audience is probably the most important part. And the audience gives you feedback and is ultimately the purchaser of your services or products. So you really need to have a handle on what your target audience thinks of you along that entire marketing funnel. So I see brand and brand strategy as the protector of audience interests, actually.
I have another question that I think that this is the perfect question to ask you because we know each other through a fitness community that you started. Mm-hmm. It seems like there's a rising importance of community in brand as well. Like I don't know, consumer brands, B2B brands alike. Like in my world, like SEMrush has, like a community now, and HubSpot's always had the big community in the forums and all of that. And that seems to sort of cultivate like not just brand to consumer communications, but like consumer to consumer communications about the brand and hosted by the brand. How have you seen the rise of, I guess, community affect branding and marketing?
I see that it's affected it because it's just, if you can actually form a very authentic community, it's another channel for which you can gather information and understand your audience better and have true brand loyalty. And those are all really, really important things. Something that I've seen in the span of my career is more of a focus on retention marketing. And so loyalty and retention is a specialty within marketing that's become increasingly important. And community is a part of that. Because again, if you can create community around your products and services, you have a system that's built to keep you growing, I guess. I think about community a lot in marketing because I find 98% of it extremely inauthentic. So I've worked with a lot of clients who are like, we're building a community. The NFT, don't even get me started on this, but I worked in NFTs for several years, and every company I worked for in that space was like, we're a community. And I was like, of what? Like, what are your values? Which comes back to brand strategy. What are you building a community around? How are you supporting this community? And I would say that most brands do it very badly. And I would also say that there's a difference between an authentic community and then just avid brand loyalists. I don't think that's the same thing, because I think, again, community means to me that there's a system in place that allows people to have back and forth conversations, to your point, with each other, with the brand. It's kind of guided. There might be some frameworks, and it's also very, very consistent. So I think it's very rare for brands to have an authentic community. But one that comes to mind, because we were talking about case studies earlier, is Glossier, right? Mm-hmm. That's how they started. They actually started based off of community. And I think that's one of probably the biggest, most authentic communities out there.
But can you go back to the NFT thing? Because I do want you to talk about the NFT thing. I wasn't in this world too deeply, but like there was the Bored Ape Yacht Club, right? Like that was a huge one. Mm-hmm. Is this what you're talking about? Sort of like you buy a $20,000 ape JPEG and then like you're part of like a community, or like what did they do wrong? I guess like you said it was inauthentic. Like what did you mean by that?
So Bored Ape actually did things right.
They were the good one.
Sort of. I mean, this is like a whole separate conversation. But they started with the sense of, they started with the idea of community. What I was talking about was that there was this sort of gold rush where all these NFT companies were popping up. And at the forefront was this idea of art and design and how that was changing. And this would be a real opportunity for artists. And I feel that a lot of the conversation was about artists have been exploited for so long, and this is an opportunity for them to take true ownership of their work, cut out the middleman, all this stuff. But then the companies who are advocating for that didn't support the artists. So or they just want to say like, we value art, we value artists, but then didn't have anything in place to actually lift them up and put them front and center. I'm not going to name names, right? But I think actually from the standpoint of community, Bored Ape did that part very well. Again, they started with the idea of community. They built a system of feedback, right, from the people who bought into the community. They had in real life events. They had the whole world that they created online, and there was a continuous feedback loop. So to me, they actually did that part well.
Yeah, that was my, I guess, like perception as well. I had a couple friends who bought Bored Apes, and like from the outside, that one always felt like they had built some sort of like common language or like mythology, and like they actually enjoyed doing their meetups together, and they had like Bored Ape merchandise. But then outside of that, there was all this FOMO, right? Like there was like 20-year-olds getting rich just like buying Dogecoin. So you're like, oh, maybe I should get into. Where I was at a friend's house once who had a massive NFT portfolio, and he was explaining, he's like, oh, this is worth however many millions. And I'm like, what's next? What should I buy? And he's like, you got to get into Pudgy Penguins. Pudgy Penguins are where it's at. And I swear I went back home and I like looked up Pudgy Penguins and I was this close to buying one. Thankfully, did not buy a Pudgy Penguin. But there was this idea of like, oh, like I want to be involved too. And I think maybe a lot of these other, maybe less community focused, less authentic NFT communities just kind of capitalized on that.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. But something you just said reminded me of, or made me think of something, which is like, what's the fine line between a club and a community? And I have to give that a lot more thought. I think that's like interesting.
A club sounds like more exclusive to me.
Well,
Just
that's
like
kind of what Bored Ape was, right?
connotation-wise.
Because you had to buy a Bored Ape.
Right.
And so was it a club or a community?
The
Or maybe
community
it's
feels
both.
like it should be lower friction. Just like the word itself feels like that to me, you know? Like you join a...
That's true. That's a good point.
What is the secret to a good community? I mean, you run a good community. I'll tell you, like, you know, I enjoy... So Goal Season, this is the group that you started that I'm in. And it's like an accountability group, but also like a WhatsApp where you're like talking and posting selfies. And I signed up for 5 workouts per week plus one jiu-jitsu lesson per week, which I have been skipping for like 3 months. So it's working. Like I'm going 5 times per week and I'm going to jiu-jitsu again. So I'm like, what is this dark magic that you've put us under, you know, in terms of this group? Like why is it effective in terms of the accountability? Why do people enjoy it? How are you doing this?
Let's back up. Goal Season is a game to track workouts with friends. It's based on a commitment towards workout accountability. The reason it works is because it appeals to several target audiences, coming back to that. Yeah. I've outlined all of this in terms of personas, but you've got somebody that will commit to working out 1 time a week, and you've got people who commit to working out 7 times or more a week. And so there's something in it for everyone. But the magic is that there's a baseline that everyone opts into, and they all agree to the rules of the game. So I think that's, when I think about why it works, that's one of the reasons why it works.
The rules are really simple too, right? It's just you pick how many workouts, or like you pick your personal goal this season and you are accountable, you post in the group. So it's like a public sort of accountability.
Exactly. Or as my friend likes to say, social shame.
Social shame.
But
yeah.
everybody is motivated by something different. So that's something else that I've really found about doing this is it's been a real insight into different motivations. But to go back to the game to further explain it, Goal Season is a game to track workouts with friends. People commit to working out a certain number of times per week, and that's an individualized number. That can be 1 to 7. And then you're penalized if you miss a workout. So that's how the game works. I've found that people are motivated by very, very different things. Some people are motivated because there's numbers attached. They've met 3 out of the 4 days that they wanted to work out. Some people are motivated because they want to win. Some people are motivated because of the community.
And some don't want to lose money.
And some don't want to lose money. So people, again, I think the game works because there's a variety of ways for people to participate. At the heart of it, I do think that people like being part of a community where there's shared beliefs.
It's interesting. Well, I mean, yeah, it's interesting because my initial thought on strong community would be that it wouldn't be as like people would have very similar goals, right? That's how a community would work really well. But you're saying that like everybody's got different goals. Like some people want to work out once a week. Some people want to work 7 times a week. My initial thought before talking to you would be like, oh, like if you're a CrossFitter and you're training for the CrossFit Games, like you join a group and you all have the same, like that would be my initial thought on like what would make a tight-knit community. But this is sort of deconstructing that belief in a way. It's like everybody shares the same rules and the same accountability measures, but your goals could be completely different. You could have somebody training for an Ironman and somebody just trying to like walk more. And it's just about the social accountability, it seems.
Yes. The It's based on number of workouts, and so that's the baseline off of which people operate and buy into. I will say that if you are an elite athlete, you may want a different baseline for the rules. And so I've experimented with very many different configurations of the rules. You're currently in a season where everyone had to work out a minimum of 4 days a week. That's new. And so I'm testing that because there was an interest in pushing boundaries from a certain subcategory of our audience, if we want to use marketing speak. And I've adjusted the rules to fit a specific mentality. But that's another beauty of the game, is that you can make it as hard or as easy as you want. So as a team captain, you can implement a lot of different sources of motivation or a lot of different rules to drive the group.
I think you're doing a bunch of things like maybe behind the scenes too that make the community feel a little bit more fun and engaging. And I'm not sure if these are conscious and proactive things, but like you've got the newsletter, right? And you celebrate different people who post selfies and like talk about like different workouts that people are doing. And then within the group itself, like you're seeding a lot of fun conversations that aren't just like logging your workout times, right? Like it feels like there's a lot of exuberance and excitement in the group itself. And I think you push a lot of that too. And I don't know if that's intentional, but it makes it feel very fun and social.
First of all, thank you for noticing. Second of all, it is both intentional, but also very authentic. I am a very people-driven person. I'm good at organizing people. Everyone that comes to the group is my friend. And I just want all my friends to be friends with everybody else. And sometimes that doesn't work, but that's a different story. And so, again, it's sort of authentic to me and who I am as a person. I also think that I think a lot about motivation. I think a lot about fitness and motivation, and people who are more engaged in consistent ways are going to fulfill their goals. So I try to make things like fun and consistent, and that is intentional.
You mentioned something similar to that at the start of the conversation with regards to your team, right? Like you being more of a facilitator of people. You know, it's like you're giving them the canvas that they can paint on, or like getting out of the way so they can explore like what they're best at and what they're interested in so they can grow. Mm-hmm. Do you see a crossover in kind of the skill that you've built with community and motivating people and like figuring out those triggers and like the team that you're working with at your agency in terms of like, I guess, management and leadership?
I don't think I ever said this, but Boas is a marketing agency that drives brand breakthroughs through strategic execution and killer creative. Just so we have that on record. In terms of my emerging roles there is a lot of crossover. Again, I think it just sort of comes naturally as a people person. So there's sort of just inherent things that I'm good at or like to do. But I also think it comes from experience and understanding what actually gets things done. So after working across industries in different agencies, being a consultant, I've noticed that tactical tasks are never typically the biggest challenge in a workplace. It's really the management of people. Management of people sounds a little robotic, maybe. So you have to define what that is for yourself as a manager or as someone that is guiding teams or leading teams. To me, managing people is just getting them to do their best work and feel invested in what they're doing. And you have to find out what motivates them, what they want to focus on, and put that front and center. And there is crossover between that and like running a fitness community because it's all about people.
Yeah, there's this book. It's the best management book I've read, I think. It's called Multipliers. And it's basically this very simple model where, like, as a manager or leader, you're either a multiplier or a diminisher. And, like, you can be both in different settings, right? Like, I read the book and I was like, yep, I've got that trait of a diminisher. You know, like, I do this, like, micromanagement thing or whatever. Like, but basically the concept is you're either multiplying somebody's capacity and potential and, like, allowing them to step into potential that they may not even have seen for themselves, right? Like, you're making them more, and like you're making them like more fulfilled and like more talented in whatever they're doing. And then diminisher, like, you're reducing somebody's genius. You know, it could be like micromanagement. It could be a lack of management, right? Like you're throwing them in the deep end and like they just don't have the tools to figure things out, but you're preventing them from like their full potential. And yeah, very simple model, but a lot of it seems to be focused on getting out of the way. Like, it seems like a lot, for me at least, it's like avoiding activities that might diminish somebody's potential is usually a bigger impact lever than, I guess, like encouragement or anything like positive that I could do. It's like getting out of the way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've found that using the diminishing model has never, ever worked. On the other hand, I have noticed that there are cases where you are invested in someone's career more than they are, and you have to draw a line somewhere. But I will say that I've just never seen the diminishing model work. It might in the short term, but it's not good for business, and it's not good for team morale, and it's not good for an individual. So, and it takes probably the same amount of effort as a more positive approach. So that's just something I've observed in my career.
I have a couple of questions on, I don't know if you noticed this, but you numbered the three things in your form. Like you numbered them 1, 3, and 2. I didn't know if that was intentional or not. If that was like probably not.
No, but what I was probably doing was trying to prioritize the information and then forgot the numbers.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll go to point number 2, which you listed third, is the integration of performance and brand marketing, which is something we think about a lot. Like I said, I come from more of a performance marketing and growth marketing background. So brand is sort of like a foreign language to me, which I'm learning more and more about. We collaborate with a lot of brand teams. So you wanted to talk about like the balance between performance and brand. Specifically, I thought what was interesting is you mentioned, like, how does one area lead or follow depending on the company stage, size, and goals? So I don't know how to frame this. It's such a broad topic, right? How do you view, I guess, like the delineation between brand and performance marketing? And like, are they two distinct categories with like a hard line? Or do you think there's some overlap? Like, can a brand campaign drive performance? Can a performance campaign, impact brand? Where are we drawing the lines here?
They definitely impact one another. And I think that's my point, is that everything should be integrated in terms of how someone looks at a marketing funnel or a marketing strategy. I have seen people waste hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on performance marketing campaigns that didn't take into account their target audience and the messaging that might hook that target audience. And so it was just money poured down a drain. And so brand has to be a factor in how performance goes out to market, because you have to think about what you're going to say at scale. And then on the flip side, you do need the performance data to validate, invalidate, test your brand messaging. So it's a push-pull, and I think that more companies or more teams would benefit from closer collaboration and not looking at this as, is it brand, is it performance, and sort of being very competitive about it, but really understanding that it is connected and you need both.
Yeah. One thing I think is challenging for brand is that it seems like it works sort of in the background, and it's like the performance campaign is almost like a lagging indicator of a lot of the brand campaigns that have been run before it. So like when I worked at HubSpot and I sent somebody a cold email, they were more likely to open that email because I had an @HubSpot.com email address versus if I just sent it from my Gmail or from a startup that nobody's heard of. So like there was some layer before that. The cold email gets the credit, right? Like whatever my subject line was, whatever like the message was, that's sort of the performance where I can track and quantify and A/B test. But there was a whole like sort of iceberg that you couldn't see like beneath the surface of the water that was like allowing that to be whatever, like 5% open rate or whatever the metric was. Similarly, like with ads, right? Like if you've got like a well-known brand, or even in Google, like search optimization, right? This is a major topic now that like Google is emphasizing brands in search. And a lot of that is because of the click-through rates and like the brand awareness that they already have. So if you've got a search result from Forbes versus some random, blogger who nobody's heard of, more people click the Forbes because they see that favicon, they see the icon, they see the website, and they're like, I know Forbes. Even if this is not the best content, they're benefiting from whatever decades or however long they've been around of brand awareness and brand sentiment, right? So I think it's hard to like track that sort of impact, whereas like performance is very like last click attribution. You could see like the data. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that's a big topic in brand marketing is the metrics around brand marketing specifically, and how do you track something like brand equity or reputation or credibility. And that there's a lot of different ways to do that. I mean, Net Promoter Score alone, right, is something that has been used for, I don't even know how, before I ever entered the industry. So, and it's still being used. And so there's different ways to track and measure. But yeah, it's a little bit more subjective. It's a little bit more, it's harder to pin down for sure. Again, there's a lot of companies coming out that are promising metrics around it, dashboards around it. Some are really interesting, but I would say that this is a good example of why you need both. HubSpot has built a brand that is very recognizable, extremely credible, and I'm sure you have more to say about this. I'm sure they track literally every data point they can.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, they've become a leader in the industry, I would assume, due to both things.
Well, what I think they were good at, and every big company also, like they don't have everything figured out, but what I think they were good at is being very clear about the goals of programs and teams and campaigns, and not sort of like crossing signals or expecting that one piece of content or one campaign is meant to do everything, right? It's like Esther Perel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So she talks about this with relationships. She's like, we now expect a single person to take the job of what used to be a village, right? So like a single piece of content probably shouldn't be gold on, brand sentiment, brand awareness, thought leadership, search optimization rankings, conversion, activation, and every metric you could possibly care about. It's like this, it may have some emergent benefits and secondary properties, but we're doing this so we can saturate segment A and raise our brand recall among this segment, right? And we're not going to track conversions. We'll track it, but it's not our primary goal. So if we miss on conversions, it's still a success if we hit this brand saturation metric, right? Like they were very like distinct about like how they would view individual teams and programs and their goals, which I thought was nice.
Sounds like really good marketing.
Totally.
Coming back to audience segmentation, something we haven't talked about that is true across startups and corporations and is part of the brand strategy process is identification of very clear goals. People across the board, regardless of what kind of organization they're in, forget that very critical step in their business or their marketing planning is identifying these very clear goals.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing I struggle with, and this is maybe because we're a smaller company with fewer data points. So I think with a large company, well-funded, you can do a lot more of like NPS and like brand recall surveys. But one thing on the branding side that I struggle with is understanding like, if my messaging is right, if it's resonating, because there's sort of a delay or lag time where I don't necessarily know if like, the website copy is bringing in fewer leads because it's the website copy or simply because fewer people in the market are looking for us right now. So how do you, I guess, like if you're doing a positioning exercise, if that culminates in a messaging framework, if you revamp your website copy, if you're using that in sales decks and sales pitches, how do you know that it's working? Or like, what are some signs, signals? It might just be vibes.
Sometimes you don't, and sometimes you have to test. Another thing that I think about a lot about in marketing is that it's one big experiment, and it constantly evolves, right? A campaign from last year probably won't work this year because our culture has changed. People change. Messaging gets stale. And a really great way to test if something is working is to set up A/B tests from the beginning. I very rarely come out with a statement or a messaging strategy that's one line and I think this is it. Like, this is the thing that's going to work. I actually have no idea sometimes. I mean, I have an educated guess, but I don't guarantee that it's going to work. Oftentimes, I come up with 5 things, and then I think to myself, well, we just need to test that. So you test it via different landing pages. You test it via ads. You test it via open rates, right, with email. So you just constantly have to look at the response that you're getting according to different messages. So there isn't like one surefire way to understand whether something is working or not. It's the collection of data and response over time. And there's qualitative ways to do that, which you're more familiar with than I am. But there's also qualitative ways. And you're right, you may not be big enough to do a brand awareness survey, but you can do other things like an audience survey. You can just look at your website numbers. You can set up A/B testing. So there's different ways to test, I think, is my conclusion.
Well, we do it. We have almost like a small business privilege in that we're sales led. So I'm taking most of the sales conversations, and then I'm also working on the marketing copy and like how we explain what we do. So I get very fast feedback, and like the challenge for me is really trying to distinguish between, I guess, like good feedback and useless feedback. So like if a message doesn't resonate with somebody who wasn't a good fit, like maybe I shouldn't take that as seriously as, a perfect fit client who doesn't get what we do. But I always look for so we've experimented with different like phrases and like ways to describe what we do. And there was one where we're like, all right, it's not just SEO, it's not just content, it's holistic, organic growth. Like, and we had like this whole, it sounded very sophisticated. And when we would talk about it to clients or prospects, they're like, what does that mean? Like they just had confusion. So that's one dimension that I look at it on. It's like, is this clear? What's the clarity of this message? Like when people see it right away, do they get it? Like, can they put us in a mental category that hopefully is attached to a budget line item, right? With enough budget to hire us. And then the second component is like the persuasiveness or differentiation or like the why us, right? First, they have to understand it. And then the second is like they have to be convinced that we're the right fit within that category. And we've at various times, because I have all these sales conversations, I've realized we're speaking about ourselves incorrectly. If we want to reach this target market, they're not getting it, or once they get it, we're not explaining our unique value proposition as well as we should be.
Clarity is extremely important because if you think of attention spans, someone needs to get it quickly. So, not to make a pitch, but BOAS revitalizes brands with clarity. That used to be an old tagline. Speaking of experimentation. And so that's something we really focus on is simplifying language and simplifying messaging so that people get what you do faster and then they choose you faster.
That was a hard lesson for me to learn, actually. After pitching larger companies and their, C-suite or executives, I always thought when I was younger in my career that like you wanted to sound as smart as possible. And then I realized that you don't want to make people feel stupid. Like, that's actually a better way to sell your ideas internally. And it's not to say that you should dumb them down, but like if something's incomprehensible or you need like a 25-slide appendix to explain like your justification, it seems like that's counterproductive. Like the past few years, I've gone the way of simplicity, far on that side of the spectrum. Whereas I used to say like, oh, we have this advanced multi-layer, multimodal system that like blah, 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 blah. And they're like, I don't get it. Do you help us rank in Google? Do you drive traffic from Google? I'm like, yes, that's what we do.
So 2 things. Number 1, going back to what I said earlier, the second part of that is knowing your audience. A C-suite person literally will give you 1 second. So you better make the best pitch you can in as short amount of time as you can and solve their problem. C-suite, they're not looking at like if you vibe, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're looking at if you solve their problem. So that needs to be front and center. Whereas, I don't know, someone further down the line, you take them out for coffee because they have the time or because that's their approach to management or whatever, like that's a different style and you have more time to explain yourself.
That's
so
true.
You really have to know your audience. And then comes in the simple messaging. What do they want to hear? How can you simplify it? So that's another factor. And then I was also going to say that you really got to think about your differentiation. So coming back to brand strategy, you mentioned something like, I thought I had to show how smart I was. Well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but there's a lot of smart people or people who say they're smart. So that's another thing. It's the messaging and what your competitors are saying about themselves. Whether it's true or not, you have to evaluate that because you're going after the same target audience. If the target audience is getting the same message, how are they going to choose somebody? They don't know if they're smart or not either, but they just have to make the choice. So this comes back to finding your unique value proposition, what sets you apart, why someone should choose you, and that needs to be very clear. What's interesting about this conversation is like if you're talking about target audiences, some of this is intuitive or guesswork or experimentation. Do you lead with I can solve your problem and then explain your differentiation? Or do you lead with your differentiation and then say, you know, kind of the problem next? But a big part of brand strategy is something I call like information hierarchy. I obviously did not make up the term. I'm just explaining my internal process. But it's like, what do you say when?
Yeah.
So I have found that through trial and error, specifically in the startup space, and it's different for every brand. But the way that I produce brand strategies, I literally will say, this is your number 1 priority. If you say nothing else, if you say 1 word, this is your word. If you say 3 words, I like literally break it out like this in a plan. It's like 1 word, 3 words, 1 line, a medium version of that, a long version of that. So, and they're numbered correctly, unlike my
I thought there was some like puzzle, like there was some like significance and you're like, okay, like I'm not doing these in order because of X, Z, and Y. But anyway.
I'll tell you a personal story. I don't know if it fits on this podcast or not. It's a little funny, but I once applied for a job and they had me take this like personality test, which made me very nervous. I took it, and in my follow-up interview, the hiring manager said, this test showed that you were not very detail-oriented. But this job requires a high level of detail-orientedness. And I remember this moment very well because I had to acknowledge that being detail-oriented is not natural for me.
Same.
I have worked around that for anyone who's listening. And now I still obviously make mistakes, but I have really worked on that. And it's just a funny little career note more than anything else. But another thing that I've learned to do is work with other people who make up for my deficiencies. So that comes back to some of the stuff we talked about with management and how you lead, how you're part of a team, how you're managed. And I really try to surround myself with people that bring balance to a project or a workspace. And going back to Boas, this has been a really fun and interesting process, but all 3 of us as the core team are super different. But I think that's what makes us work.
That's the same thing with the Omniscient, our 3 co-founders. But I can bring this back to positioning too. So is it better to emphasize and strengthen your strengths, or to focus on shoring up your weaknesses and making sure that your weaknesses aren't as apparent, right? Like as a branding functionality, hypothetically, we're amazing at scale. We're really good at content production at scale. We're not as good at, I mean, I'm making this up. We're not as good at design, right? Should we work on our design capacities, or should we fully lean into the fact that we are the high scale content production agency?
It depends. I feel like I've said that maybe 300 times. It depends on your business goals, your specific growth goals, your target audience, and the scale at which you're operating. To answer your question directly, maybe I should have started there, is marketing is about focus, and I would focus on that idea of scale, because you want to become known for one thing, and then you can expand. I have this conversation every day, because in the startup space, and I've been there, I did this with my own brand. You're like, there's 10 things that make us special, and, we're differentiated in these 30 ways, and you cannot tell a customer that. It's too overwhelming. So you really want to focus on the one thing that you think sets you apart. You might have to change that, right? Going back to testing and getting feedback and getting more information around it. But you really want to be known for one thing, and then you can expand. So I can think of a lot of like D2C companies that launch with one product, and now they have an entire product line. Or if you think about the agency space, right? Not many agencies come out of the gates being a full service agency. So start somewhere, show expertise. When you're out there as a thought leader and showing that expertise, people will sort of naturally come to you and say, oh, but can you do this too? I mentioned the scale thing because if you're already there and you're kind of known for that, then you can start to add on different products and services. And maybe you don't do that internally, right? That's where acquisitions come into play, or partnerships. Yeah. And so you don't necessarily have to do it, again, just to emphasize internally, this is a whole business strategy endeavor, but there's different ways to fold that in.
It seems like both on the personal and the company level, if a weakness is preventing you from success, or like killing deals, or like, detail orientation is like preventing you from getting jobs, or like getting fired all the time, then like you have to, either shore that up, or like compensate for it, or like have a system that like eliminates that as like a risk factor, or go to a job where it doesn't matter, right? Like that could be a thing too. But it seems like the principal kind of like value is lean into something that like identifies you with a concept. So it's like, you want to be known for one thing. You don't necessarily want to have 10 strengths that are all equally weighted, because then you're kind of known for nothing. So it seems like unless that weakness, unless that like lack of design, if it's killing deals, then you want to like maybe think about that and be like, hey, should we partner with somebody? Should we acquire somebody? Should we shore that up? Right. But until that becomes apparent, it seems like really focusing on the strength would be to your advantage. That's
what I would do.
You want to do some non-work rapid fire stuff?
I haven't been very rapid, but I'll try.
They don't actually have to be rapid. It's more trivialities. A question that I love to ask, this is stolen from Tyler Cowen, one of my favorite thinkers and podcasters. Like a violinist or a musician practices scales, right, to improve their craft. How do you stay sharp? What is your version of a musician practicing scales?
In my personal bio, I think I mentioned that I'm an unconventional leader and startup tinkerer. And so to sharpen my skills, not only do I have my client work, but I'm just constantly thinking about marketing and branding and experimenting with brands of my own. I have like 10 brands.
What's your superpower as a marketer? What do you do differently? What's your differentiation?
My differentiation is 3 things. Number 1, I understand how all the different marketing channels are connected, and that drives efficiency. I started my career in performance. I transitioned into brand strategy, and I've worked at startups where you have to, quote unquote, wear many hats. So I've been exposed to everything from managing a brand strategy process to doing foundational performance work. I am not a performance marketer, but I actually really understand the basics. And so because I know how it's all connected, again, I can drive efficient marketing plans, and I know when and where to spend budget according to your size, scale, and goals. The second thing that differentiates me is that I focus on strategic foundations because I understand how that drives the rest of the marketing channels. So I'm always the person, which gets very annoying for some people, that will take a step back, as I've actually done several times today. And it's like, well, why this? Why that? What are the goals? This is not clear. This is a little off topic, but I think one of my strengths is actually being of like average intelligence, because if I don't understand something, your customer is not going to understand something. So if I can come to a marketing plan or a messaging strategy and say, like, this doesn't make sense to me, you should probably listen to me because I don't think I'm brilliant. And I think that if I don't understand it, I know that a majority of people are not going to understand it. Because typically, this is obviously not true for every brand, but your audience isn't Mensa level people, right? So I think that's actually kind of a strength of mine.
Or even if they are, it's like there's a lot in our world, in B2B especially, where I have to be like, what do you mean by ABM? What does that mean?
Oh, don't get me
And then when you
acronyms.
ask somebody, you realize there's no there, and it's just like ABM's maybe different, but like there's so many things that people just sort of repeat. And I would add to that last one, I don't know if it's average intelligence, but I would say it's kind of brave to be the one asking the question when everybody is pretending to understand something, and you have to be. Have you been in like group projects or like I've done these little leadership retreats, right? Like where everybody's going around and talking, and like if you're the one who asks the silly question, it kind of takes a lot of like gumption to be like, what does that mean, right? But then everybody else in the group goes, yeah, what does that? And it opens everybody up to admit sort of humility and ignorance on the topic.
I found that to be true. I don't mind putting myself out there, and I've taken a lot of risks, and I've had a lot of failures. So at this point, I don't mind being the person. I also think that sometimes, even if everyone does understand, it does help everyone get on the same page. Mm-hmm. And that's really valuable as well. So there's multiple benefits to being that person, I guess. The other way that I differentiate myself is that I really understand the startup space, and I understand what you need at what stage you're in and for what goals you have. So I mentioned this earlier, but I've seen people waste money on messaging that didn't work or ads that didn't work. And I would have never advocated that they spend that money without doing some of the other work first and investing in some audience research or some testing at least. Or, again, it almost pains me when this happens because this is my favorite part of the process. But, if people are like, I'm going to rebrand, I'm like, don't do that. You're not at the stage in which the time, effort, and resources it will take to do that is going to move the needle. Mm-hmm. Like, you need to focus on, like, getting your numbers up, like your click-through rate or whatever. But I think I have a good sense of what needs to be done at what stage. So that also sets me apart.
What's your productivity system? How do you have so many brands and communities and ostensibly still maintain a sleep schedule and social life? Like, how are you getting everything done?
I'm glad you asked this question because it reminds me of the point I meant to make about differentiation is that I ruthlessly prioritize. So that's been a lifelong journey. And I have so much to say about this. It's still a struggle. I am somebody that has a lot of ideas. I am interested in a lot of different things. I'm pulled in a lot of different directions. So it requires a lot of discipline that didn't come to me naturally. But I've learned to think about my day and my practice from the angle of prioritization. and actually labeling things. So, for example, for my hobbies, I used to position them as like business ideas. Like, I'm working on this business idea. And the biggest shift for me in the last 2 years was that I was like, this is a hobby. So when I have extra time, or even when I don't, but I'm distracted, I say, okay, is this really the most important thing to work on right now? Because this is not a business that's generating revenue. This is a hobby. So I think really thinking through prioritization helps me. It is not a perfect system. I'm not the best at time management, but I surround myself with people who are really good at time management and who also prioritize and who are also very energetic. And so that serves as a model for me too. When I get off track, I can go to these friends or these colleagues and talk to them about their day and then just sort of get inspired to stay on track.
What do you consider the most overrated virtue?
Oh man, this is a tough question. What's yours? To throw it back to you. You know what? I should have been asking you a lot more questions during this whole time. You can do that at any point.
Yeah. I've heard so many answers on this, and I can usually see somebody's point. I think that in many contexts, patience, like in our context as a business owner, like a small business, right? I think people say patience is a virtue, but like usually if we truncate the timeline, people get things done and they're more satisfied with it anyway. And actually when we extend timelines for ourselves and for everybody else, if we like now my thing is like, just do the thing in front of me. Do it right now. Answer the email. Like if we have an idea for a project, like do the first thing to get it in motion. Instead of saying, we're going to table this, we're going to wait 3 months to see like how we feel. And we're going to come up with a plan. We're going to like be organized about this. We just do things and it's like less stressful. And like we have more momentum and more motivation. So that's been kind of a paradoxical thing for me.
Great is the enemy of good.
Yeah, exactly.
I got the idiom correct this time.
Yeah, it's sort of a way to beat perfectionism. And yeah, patience, I think sometimes is maybe an excuse that is backed in a sort of fear and perfectionism. So that's the thing is like with this, is you're sort of doing like a postmodern deconstructionism thing where you're like flipping, a common virtue on its head and saying like, well, in this context, it's actually not that great. I'm trying to think of other ones. I guess like politeness could be,
You don't believe in politeness?
No, I think it's good to be kind, but I think in being polite, you can often be a people pleaser and you can avoid what is like true communication in both personal relationships and work settings. I don't think you should be an asshole, but like I think a lot of the times when we just cut to it, we just talk about the thing instead of like talk around the thing, we all usually end up closer for it and we actually move forward with whatever work problem we're dealing with. So I think, politeness oftentimes can be an overrated virtue.
Not to sell myself even more from my points of differentiation, but I believe in directness. And this comes back to some of the things we talked about. So hopefully this is illustrative of a larger point, which is the testing of messaging and getting feedback. Clients come to me because I'm very direct. I've been told that like maybe 15 times. And so I'm just agreeing with you that I think maybe there's a balance somewhere of being like polite and direct. I have to think about this more, but I'm just saying that I share that view. When you ask me that question on a virtue, this comes back to something else I was saying, that I think my role is often to kind of take a step back and be like, what is a virtue?
Mm-hmm, totally. Yeah.
That's like where my brain went.
That's the first layer is like, it's because a virtue is really like a commonly agreed upon positive trait, right? So what is commonly agreed upon? And then you've got to like flip that and say like, well, where is the majority wrong? So it's sort of a contrarianism thing.
Yeah.
And it commonly agreed upon depends on like where you're from too. Like politeness, I'm from Wisconsin, and then I moved to Texas, so like that was a very big value there. Mm-hmm. East Coast, a little bit less, So it's I actually prefer it over here. It's like we don't all have, I guess, like the same virtues, depending where you're from.
True, and there's different definitions of that word. Something I spend a lot of time thinking about is how everyone has a different definition of every single word. Mm-hmm. Especially in the marketing space, actually. If you look at someone, or if you go to someone random and ask them what branding is, they're going to give you a very different answer than what I gave. But I haven't answered your question, and I think it's because I don't believe in virtues, maybe.
Expound? What do you mean by that?
I guess where my brain went is that to even state behaviors as virtues, which I don't know and I will look into later, seems to stem from some religious roots. There's a tinge of self-righteousness to it that makes me uncomfortable.
I want to explore more, but we're going to wade into like very philosophical territory if we do.
Here we go. This turns into a philosophy podcast.
Right. Now we're like, what is the root of belief?
This whole thing has been an exercise in a brand strategy pivot for you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we've had some pretty large digressions in these podcasts, so we're cool with that. Who do you admire professionally and why?
Sarah Blakely from Spanx. She comes across, at least, as extremely authentic, driven, positive. Top line stories of her is that she treats her employees very well. She was a tinkerer. She accepted failure. And I just haven't read one bad thing about her, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I don't care. I also love Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Same. Why?
The drive, the motivation. He's somebody that dove very deep and developed expertise in one area and then expanded, right? Mm-hmm. And now he's known for dominating 3 extremely different segments of life, right? So bodybuilding, acting, and then politics at the top of the game. That's completely insane.
Yeah, his autobiography was so inspiring. Some of it, I had to wonder, I'm like, is this real? Or like, is he, because he talked about how he like invented the 2 a day for the bodybuilding. Not invented, but like he popularized it. And he's like, yeah, I did 2.5 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours in the evening. And I'm like, yo, like I said earlier before we recorded that, yeah, if he was in goal season, he would win.
Actually, he has a newsletter and an app, and I've started to follow both. And there's some crossover with
that's cool.
With some messaging, some motivation. But maybe that's because I run goal season and I am motivated by Schwarzenegger. So maybe I'm getting the inspiration there.
What's a career choice that you considered but didn't pursue?
Oh, so many. Coming back to my varied interests. I'll start with this one because I think, again, it's actually a good illustration of marketing practices, to tie it back to that. I was in marketing. I thought about going into public health. Instead of just diving into it and starting to study and get into school, I just really didn't know that much about it. And there's also this idea that something can be very interesting and you might even enjoy studying it, but what's the practical application of this? I spent a summer interviewing one person a week who was in public health, and that's target audience. Well, I guess that's not target audience research, but it's research, mm-hmm. right? It's getting a lay of the land. It's understanding the personas that might be attracted to public health and what they were doing. They were all doing something different within that space. I think 1 out of 8 people loved what they were doing, and everyone else was like, do not do this. So I didn't do it.
I've heard about people doing that with like law specifically because it's one of those like high status careers where you're like, okay, I am not great at math. So I'm like, doing a humanities degree, but I still want a high status career. So like, I'm going to go to law school. Mm-hmm. And then they'll interview people or like shadow them at work. And they're like, wait, this is what the job is? And they're like, wait, I don't want to do this at all. And, some portion of people probably shadow and they do enjoy it. But I think seeing it firsthand makes you say like, wait, I genuinely didn't know this is what the job was.
Yeah. Nikki Carter, who introduced us, she was in law school and doing very well. And she did the same thing. She started to interview people. She started to talk to people, specifically in our area of interest. And she decided it wasn't for her.
So interesting. I think we should wind down soon, but I wanted to just open it and say, like, is there anything we didn't explore with regards to brand marketing, performance marketing, any like sort of last thoughts there?
My final thoughts are that every company, every organization, every personal brand can benefit from doing brand strategy exercises along the journey. So not just at the start of their business, not just the start of a campaign, but the constant reevaluation of some basic principles is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, it seems like even if you didn't change, like the macro environment could, thus your previous messaging might be outdated or like falling flat in this timeline, right? Especially like, post-pandemic, like is your messaging, the same now as it was before COVID? Is your messaging and positioning the same now that SaaS valuations are much lower? Like we've had to think a lot about that, about what resonates. So it could be just like that consumer behavior or the macro environment's changing, in which case you should also, I guess, revisit how you're speaking to people.
Branding ultimately helps you navigate the currents of culture.
That's a great quote.
It's a good one to end on.
Do you want to point people anywhere online? Like, where can people find you?
boasagency.com.
BOAS agency. And we'll put links in the show description and show notes.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.